Breaking news, Europe is lashing out after Donald Trump makes a dramatic new move to pressure allies over Greenland, this time by tying trade punishment directly to a territorial demand. And the question tonight is simple. When a US president starts using tariffs like a geopolitical crowbar, what happens to NATO unity, global markets, and the rules-based order? Because this is not a vague threat. It's a written escalation with dates, targets, and a clear condition. In this video, I'll cover three major points. First, what Trump just announced and why European leaders are calling it unacceptable. Second, the deeper mechanism, how tariff coercion turns into economic damage and political instability. And third, the ripple effects, from American families and businesses to corporate supply chains to international security in the Arctic. So ask yourself, is this negotiation or a test of how far allies can be pushed? Here's what just happened in plain terms. Trump announces escalating tariffs on 8 European nations and links those tariffs to one demand, a deal for the complete and total purchase of Greenland by the United States. According to reporting, the tariff starts at 10% on February 1st, then rises to 25% on June 1st, and remains in place until a Greenland purchase deal is struck. The targeted countries listed include Denmark, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And it gets worse. This isn't happening in a vacuum. European allies recently send small troop deployments and begin joint activity in Greenland, with reporting describing a European effort called Operation Arctic Endurance and additional French assets being pledged. European leaders respond with unusually blunt language. The UK's Prime Minister says applying tariffs on allies tied to NATO security is completely wrong, and France's president calls the tariff threat unacceptable, emphasizing Europe won't be swayed by intimidation. Sweden's leader says they won't be blackmailed, and the EU response moves fast. An emergency meeting of EU ambassadors is called in Brussels, as European institutions and lawmakers warn that tariff threats could spiral into a broader transatlantic rupture. Now, a personal example. Imagine a Danish-owned logistics supplier operating in the US, importing parts from Europe with contracts priced months in advance. A sudden 10% tariff can wipe out margins overnight, but a 25% tariff looming in June? That's not policy. It's a deadline with a financial gun to the head. How do you run a business on threats and shifting conditions? So the key issue isn't just Greenland. The issue is this. Can allies function when trade is used as leverage for territory? Let's break down the mechanism, because this story is bigger than one headline. Trump's move is what analysts call coercive trade policy, using tariffs not primarily to protect domestic industry, but to force political outcomes. The logic is simple. Agree to my demand, or your exporters pay a penalty. That's why European leaders are reacting so sharply. In their view, this crosses from negotiation into pressure tactics against allied sovereignty. Now here's the kicker. Greenland isn't just a symbolic prize. Greenland is strategically positioned between North America and the Arctic, and its geography matters for surveillance, early warning, and regional security. Reporting highlights the U.S. military already operates Patuxent Space Base in Greenland, built under a 1951 defense agreement framework between Denmark and the U.S. So critics immediately ask, if the U.S. already has military access, why escalate to ownership demands and tariff threats? This is where the policy mechanics matter. A tariff functions like a tax on imported goods. If the U.S. places a 10% tariff on goods from major European economies, costs rise across supply chains. Importers either pass that cost on to consumers, absorb it as reduced profit, or shift suppliers, often at higher expense. Then the threat of a jump to 25% creates what markets hate most, uncertainty. And it gets worse because the target list includes some of America's closest NATO partners. NATO's central promise is collective defense and collective security. But if trade penalties are used to punish allies, for defending a territory that is politically linked to a NATO member. What does that do to trust? Reuters reporting on the NATO side describes allies scrambling for ways to boost Arctic security while warning that a forcible takeover scenario would be unprecedented inside the alliance and could severely weaken NATO. It also notes the US already has a base and can deploy more forces under existing agreements. Then comes the institutional response. European Parliament leaders and major political figures argue the tariff threats undermine security and embolden adversaries. NBC reports European Parliament President Roberta Metsola says the measures risk emboldening our joint enemies, and EU officials warn tariffs can make both sides poorer and fracture allied unity. Now the analogy, imagine NATO as a fire department that agrees to protect every house in the neighborhood. Greenland is one of those houses connected to Denmark, but now the chief of the biggest fire truck says, I'll still help fight the fire, but I'm also going to raise the water bill unless you sell me the house. That is not teamwork, that is leverage. And when leverage replaces trust, systems break. We're also seeing a public legitimacy battle. PBS reports European leaders release a statement reaffirming Greenland belongs to its people and that only Denmark and Greenland decide their future. That is a direct rejection of the US framing. And look at the human reality. Greenland's population is around 56,000, and polling cited in reporting shows 85% oppose joining the US. That alone undermines the simple transaction narrative. So the deep dive conclusion is clear. This is a high-stakes collision of economics, sovereignty, and alliance security, compressed into tariff deadlines. The question becomes, what happens if Europe refuses? Now let's talk about impact. Who gets hit and how fast? First, consumers get squeezed. Tariffs don't magically stay overseas. A 10% tariff on imports is a cost that moves through retail pricing, parts supply, and basic goods. And if the tariff rises to 25% in June, that's not a minor adjustment. It's a shock. Second, workers in industries reliant on European components, automotive parts, industrial machinery, medical devices, face production uncertainty. Companies delay orders, pause hiring, and push risk down the chain. Third, families already worried about affordability get caught in the middle of a geopolitical contest they never voted for. And here's the rhetorical question. Should everyday Americans pay higher prices because of a territorial fight in the Arctic? Picture a small US importer that buys precision tools from Germany and Denmark. Their contracts are signed quarterly. If February 1st arrives with a 10% tariff, their next shipment is instantly more expensive. They can raise prices, but customers switch to competitors. They can absorb it, but margins collapse. Or they can scramble for new suppliers, often slower and more expensive. The business owner isn't debating sovereignty, they're debating survival. Large corporations can pivot faster, but they still hate instability. When tariffs are tied to unpredictable political demands, CFOs start building risk buffers into guidance. That reduces investment, slows expansion, and disrupts global production schedules. A tariff timeline, 10% then 25%, forces companies to plan for the worst-case scenario. Europe is not just complaining. EU leaders discuss coordinated response, emergency meetings are called, and European lawmakers openly float pausing or withholding progress on trade arrangements. NBC reports European Parliament figures argue the EU cannot proceed business as usual while trade is used as political coercion, and it gets worse at the security level. Reuters reports NATO is scrambling for Arctic security ideas while its credibility takes collateral damage from the tension, and officials warn divisions benefit adversaries. Experts warn that once Allied trust breaks, rebuilding it can take years. And once trade becomes a weapon inside alliances, every future crisis becomes harder to manage because partners start asking, are we next? So the ripple effect isn't confined to Greenland. It's supply chains, inflation expectations, alliance cohesion, and deterrence credibility, moving together like dominoes. From Europe, multiple leaders call the tariff threats unacceptable and reject blackmail framing. Sweden's leader says they won't be blackmailed, and European leaders emphasize only Denmark and Greenland decide the territory's future. From European institutions, NBC reports European Parliament President Roberta Metsola warns the measures won't help Arctic security and could embolden enemies, while EU officials argue security concerns should be addressed inside NATO, not through trade punishment. From NATO's own stage, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte's public transcript shows the tension is unavoidable. Questions repeatedly press whether it is acceptable for an ally to threaten force or seize territory, while Rutte emphasizes Arctic security cooperation and avoids commenting on internal disputes. The transcript also references 56,000 people in Greenland and the 1951 agreement context being raised in questioning. Expect immediate trade and diplomatic escalation, EU coordination, potential counters, and intense negotiations before Feb 1. Corporate lobbying will spike, and markets will price in uncertainty around tariffs and retaliation. If June's 25% threat remains on the table, companies will start making longer-term moves, rerouting supply chains, reconsidering investment in transatlantic trade exposure, and building redundancy that raises costs permanently. The key implication is brutal: using tariffs to pressure allies over territory risks, turning a strategic alliance into a transactional standoff. And once you normalize coercion, you invite retaliation. So the question is, does this end in a deal or does it end in a fractured West? Here are the three most critical points. 1. Trump escalates the Greenland push by tying it to punitive tariffs, 10% starting February 1st, potentially 25% by June 1st, targeting 8 European allies. 2. Europe responds with open defiance, emergency meetings, and warnings that coercive trade tactics weaken shared security. 3. The economic and security fallout hits everyone: American families, small businesses, and NATO's credibility, while experts warn adversaries benefit from allied division. The takeaway is this: when trade becomes a weapon inside alliances, everyone becomes a target. So tell me, does this pressure strategy work, or does it backfire and weaken America's position long term? If you want to stay informed on stories the mainstream media won't fully cover, make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell icon. Final thought: alliances survive on trust. Once you price trust in tariffs, the bill comes due. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.